the normalization of thousands of people drowning in the Mediterranean and us not really shrugging our shoulders about it anymore.
It is something that we have to deal with in politics. For instance, in the Netherlands today, migration was a huge issue in the elections.
We know that hundreds of millions of people will be displaced by the effects of the climate crisis.
Our climate crisis, we're in a very unique position here in the Netherlands. And so we're pretty privileged in that sense.
I'm a literary scholar, so I'm someone who is really investigating literary fiction.
So my name is Michiel Bot, and I'm an associate professor of law and humanities at this university.
Hi, so my name is Philip Payments. I'm a professor of law and governance in the Anthropocene at Tilburg Law School.
Hi, I'm Kate Huber. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Culture Studies at Tilburg University.
Migration studies is many things at the same time. It can also be seen as something that we have observed since very long ago. People always have migrated, some people say. So migration studies focuses on all these different developments at the same time. And culture is something that is about our traditions and conditions and conventions and so on. And when you are studying culture studies, you are getting a lot of knowledge on how people are thinking about their own identity, their identity in a group, their identity in a nation state. And of course, when you are talking about that type of issues, migration is super important, because today in the Netherlands, there are people coming in, entering the Netherlands from other places in the world. What is the effect of it? What are the political discussions that are really strong at the moment on migration?
For myself, I work mostly on litigation, so on bringing conflicts to court, dealing with climate change and the environment. And I'm particularly interested in cases that seek to articulate concerns about climate justice, so not just about mitigating emissions or transitioning to renewable energy more quickly, but also claims that try to articulate responsibility for the already ongoing harm of the changing climate that communities face, but not all communities, but particularly vulnerable communities and marginalized communities. Right now, there's a case in formation here in the Netherlands being brought forward by a group of plaintiffs of claimants from Bonaire that are articulating the Dutch state has failed to invest in climate adaptation resources for Bonaire, and that the community in Bonaire is the most kind of at risk. A group of Dutch residents, because of course they are Dutch citizens and residents, and so they've been placed at the very kind of front line of a changing climate within the Netherlands, and have also been given some police resources to help them overcome kind of increasing extreme weather events. I mean, it's really complex in that law is both absolutely essential for creating the climate crisis. I mean, essentially all of the emitting activities that caused the climate crisis were done largely as lawful activities. At the same time, the law is a site where climate activists are engaging to try to come with solutions to respond to it at the same time. So you have this kind of contradiction within the law itself. It facilitated what in retrospect were very harmful practices. And for a long time, we didn't know that they were harmful. And for a long time, we did, right? Let's be frank about that. But, to kind of condemn emissions in the 19th century would be a bit short-sighted in that we didn't understand the way that climate systems worked at that time, right? But we also have known for many decades now that what we're doing was harmful and shouldn't be happening, and we continue to do so. And the law continued to allow states and economic actors, large emitters, to do so. The law is also a very powerful resource for climate action. I think it's very difficult to conceive of a world where we have resolved wholly or partially the climate crisis without having used the law to do so. It's kind of a necessary evil to use these tools and find a way to live on this planet more sustainably.
This past year, the Dutch king apologized for slavery. And the Prime Minister actually mentioned this book repeatedly in his apologies for slavery, which was nice. And then at the same time, he concludes a deal with the Tunisian president that leads to the death of many Black people. So I think, for me, this is the biggest issue when you talk about migration, and that relates to the history of colonialism and slavery as well. I think that's the biggest issue both in the Netherlands and in Europe, actually, and also relates to the question of Palestine. Is another case in which race generally gets ignored, but in the way in which many Dutch people identify primarily with white Israelis.
Environmental justice is the uneven distribution of the benefits and burdens of extraction economies and colonialism and the wealth accumulated during the history of colonialism. So today we see, for example, that the global south is disproportionately impacted by the effects of the climate crisis, and they are often forced to relocate, and we see, for example, with island communities in the South Pacific, that their homelands are disappearing and they're being displaced, and this forces migration. We know that hundreds of millions of people will be displaced by the effects of the climate crisis. And so when we think about climate justice, we're thinking about the ways in which people who have created the climate crisis are actually not the ones who are experiencing the effects of that as much, and they're not the ones that are being forced to move, at least at present. So when we think about environmental justice and the uneven distribution of the effects of climate change on different communities around the world, Europe is going to experience an intense amount of migration, and as we can already see, these are issues that affect people and our discussions even in the Netherlands today. So that's why they're all connected. We know that under-resourced communities are more affected by pollution and more affected by the precarity of the climate crisis and flooding, for example. But we haven't quite figured out ways in which to mobilize around these different issues, and sometimes the theories don't quite apply. So that's one of the challenges that we're working on today in the Department of Culture Studies, along with the Faculty of Law, to really come up with interdisciplinary ways that we can think about how environmental justice and climate change and migration can actually come into closer conversation in a European context. These are things that are actually giving us some cultural evidence about how climate change, media, and migration are interconnected, and help us to better understand and talk about our current moment.
The most important thing that people should know about climate justice, eco-justice, climate change is that it is about us. It is not something that is for other people in other countries somewhere far away. It concerns us, it concerns you, it concerns me. So we have to think about the consequences of our own behavior. We have to think about our own responsibility, our own ideas and wishes and dreams and so on. We don't think that it's happening elsewhere. It's really now and here, and it's about us.
Well, one crucial starting point for thinking about migration and climate justice, I think, is the realization that there is only one world and that we are in this together.
I think we need to remember that a lot of the climate migration that is happening was caused by the ways that people in Europe have enjoyed life in the past few hundred years, and the systems that have been set up that have really created systems of precarity for particular groups of people. I think there's a sentiment at the moment that we can't quite sense the urgency of this, or if you're not directly experiencing a precarious situation yourself, that it somehow isn't as urgent. There is an uneven distribution of the benefits and burdens of extraction economies and of colonialism.
But I think we need to be prepared to have conversations about the kind of more global footprint of the Dutch state, but also Dutch companies, and how there are consequences for the wealth that they have generated through their activities abroad, and that we're going to start to see many more campaigns looking to take some of that wealth to compensate for some of the damage associated with their activities. Today I'm here really to learn about the work of my colleagues in the Humanities faculty, who I don't know that well. And I get the impression that there's a lot more work going on in climate and environmental justice here in the university outside of the law school that myself and my colleagues don't know about.
Yeah, I definitely gained a lot of new insights from today. A lot of the ways that my colleagues were talking about critical theory of migration, what collective action looks like for displaced people, and how court systems in Europe recognize their agency and personhood.
Our life at the university is very much driven by our faculty identities, who we teach, when we teach, the subjects we teach, what we do research on, who we share it with, is all very much defined by the faculty that you work for. And so you have, in our organization, in our university community, colleagues working on very similar issues, concerns from different disciplinary backgrounds and perspectives and different questions, certainly, but really overarching questions about what does environmental justice mean in today's world.
At the university, we have very fixed programs. This is what you do in your master, this is what you do in your bachelor. And a workshop like this opens it up, brings together people and students from law, from culture studies, from philosophy, from economics.
So I think this is very interesting about this conversation. It's really asking questions about how these different disciplines can be combined productively to address one of the most urgent topics of our time. And so far, as often with conferences, it's the most interesting parts are the Q&As, and to hear what people had to ask and then see how people respond to these concerns in ways that are sometimes much more nuanced than you would expect based on the presentation that people give.
And the goal is that you'll somehow get new ideas you did not had before.
And it's really unfortunate that we don't work together more often, essentially. We have a lot to learn from each other.